Okay, I think we can start this off now. Thanks everybody for coming. My name's Craig Smith, and I work at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne, and that is on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So first off, I would like to extend our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And if there are any Indigenous people in the digital room today, we would like to extend our warm welcome to them as well. So we've got an interesting talk ahead of us. Thanks very much to Phyllis and Lennon for their hard work in setting this up. I just come in as a host. So Ian Rowan is joining us today. I'll briefly introduce him. Ian is joining us from Taiwan. He's an associate professor at National Taiwan Normal University. Before that, he was at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, of course. And before he published his book "One China, Many Taiwans," he also edited a book in 2021 called "Transitions in Taiwan: Stories of the White Terror." So that was a collection of short stories in translation. It came out with Cambria as part of their Taiwan literature series. It's a great book. I've got a copy myself. And then in 2022, very busy, isn't it? 2022, he published "One China, Many Taiwans," and that's with Cornell University Press. And this is a really interesting book because of all the books we've had on Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait or the Taiwan-China issues in the last, decades, nobody has ever looked at this from the perspective of tourism. Of course, tourism is a topic that we're all very familiar with. I think we're all tourists. We're all bad tourists sometimes as well. But Ian has been looking specifically at Chinese tourists in Taiwan. And looking back now, I guess in some ways that was a short-lived phenomenon, but perhaps in many other ways, we hope that we will see more tourists in the future. But yes, it's not my job to introduce this book. It's Ian. So Ian, do you want to take over now?
Sure. Thanks so much, Craig, for the introduction, and to Lennon and Phyllis for inviting me. I guess I should give a little bit of personal background as to why I would pick such a strange topic and why I would subject myself to months and months of interviewing and traveling with Chinese tourists around Taiwan at the only time that was really possible, which was during the Ma Ying-jeou administration between 2008 and 2016. Prior to that, I'd lived in Taiwan from 2001 to 2005 under very different conditions within Taiwan and between Taiwan and China. And then in 2006, I worked as a tour guide in China, taking mostly English-speaking tourists around all over China. I was based in Beijing and taking so-called luxury travelers around Beijing, but also the whole country. And realizing that as I was touring them around the Great Wall or around the Terracotta Warriors or up the Three Gorges Dam, I was very much mediating their experience. I was not only translating between English and Mandarin, but also translating China as a territory in a way that had material effects, because my guests included Goldman Sachs bankers, people who went on actually to be dragged in front of the US Congress during the great financial crisis for malfeasance and other things. So people who are actually in a position to direct resources in and out of China were having sometimes their first experiences there being mediated through me, this incredibly amateur character, frankly, with minimal training in 2006. And a year after that, I went from that job to work in a Taiwan-owned art hotel and art park in southern China in Guilin. And this was Taiwan-owned, Taiwan-managed, but mostly staffed by Chinese people. And our guests were really a wide variety. They came from all over the world. And I realized while working in this place, while working in this company run by Taiwanese, but staffed by Chinese, that even though we seemed to be speaking the same language, and I was mostly speaking Mandarin on the job when I wasn't talking to guests. The Taiwanese and Chinese were constantly misunderstanding, misinterpreting, misreading, sometimes willfully or not, in ways that were sometimes intentional and sometimes not. Often they would tactically play as ethnic or national compatriots when it was convenient, and other times that sense of not so much solidarity, but perhaps tactical alliances would fall apart when conditions were different. And again, I realized that tourism was in many ways a very powerful political kind of technology, not just a mode of cultural interaction or cultural representation, but again, something that might have material impacts on the way Chinese and Taiwanese understand each other, set policy, and then would be interacting under very different conditions starting in 2008. And indeed, 2008 is where this book begins. And this is 2 years before I began the field work. This book came out of a PhD dissertation that was begun as a master's thesis in 2010. And the timing was just right, because this was really the only time that this work could be done. And so I'll just kind of go in and give you a snapshot there through the introduction of how special those conditions were, and why tourism between China and Taiwan is really so remarkable, but also so illuminating, not just for this case, but for considering the territorial politics of tourism in general. In 2008, as the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, pointed thousands of missiles towards Taiwan, it started sending millions of tourists the same way. And as we can see on the top left, standard missile picture, but on the top right is actually a very particular picture of the very first tour group from Fujian province. And tourism started with tour groups, not with independent tourists, but with tour groups, in this case, from the nearest province, right across the strait. And these tourists were welcomed not only by a travel industry eager for new sources of revenue, but by President Ma Ying-jeou, who was elected earlier that year. President Ma had claimed that the opening would strengthen the economy and improve Taiwan's relations with what he called mainland China. The tourists, said Ma's administration, might return home with a positive impression of Taiwan's democracy, which could lead to mutual understanding and maybe even political reconciliation. But still, despite this growing flow of leisure travelers and the social, economic, and political connections that they facilitated, citizens and officials on both sides of the Taiwan Strait didn't quite agree on the cultural character or the spatial definition of the territories they were traveling between. And it turned out, as I conclude with the book, that tourism really deepened the difference. As far as most Chinese tourists were concerned, they were traveling in part of China, culturally familiar, if undeniably distinct politically. Indeed, Taiwan, an archipelago with 23 million people, the western shore of its main island, which I'm on, 150 kilometers away across a heavily militarized strait, was listed as a province on all PRC maps and passports. As far as Chinese authorities were concerned, the ultimate goal of all cross-strait policy, including tourism, was political control and ultimately annexation, euphemistically referred to as unification and defined as a, quote, national core interest. And some China-friendly leaders in Taiwan also hoped for territorial unification, even if they had a very different idea of what that future China would look like and how it would be governed. And we have a sense of this actually just in the last day, even in Taiwan today, where the vast majority of Taiwan supports, if not the status quo, outright de facto independence. Even people asserting Taiwan's sovereignty yesterday, that being the current administration, celebrated the Republic of China's birthday yesterday in a what seems in many ways a very anachronistic kind of celebration. But of course, many people in Taiwan had a very different idea, which was that these mainland guests, or luke, as they called them, were entering a different country entirely, where they were welcome to spend their money, have a good time, mind their own business, and then go home. For those concerned about PRC irredentism, tourism looked like another one of several weapons aimed at Taiwan's sovereignty. As it happened, at the same time that cross-strait tourism accelerated, so did Taiwanese national identification and pro-independence sentiment, leading to unprecedented protests and electoral shifts against PRC-friendly politicians. Really, the potential for tension should have been clear, because 2008 was not the first time that Taiwan had received a rapid influx of arrivals from China. 60-odd years earlier, at the close of World War II, Taiwan had been overwhelmed by weary and desperate soldiers serving the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the KMT, the Kuomintang, who were then retreating from the military advance of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, or CPC, however you like. And these soldiers and the KMT-dominated state apparatus that they propped up, the Republic of China, occupied Taiwan in 1945 with the support of the US after Imperial Japan was forced to end its half-century of colonization. Many Taiwanese saw the military men as uncouth and unhygienic, qualities not so dissimilar from those later attributed to 21st century tourists. But unlike today's visitors, these soldiers had nowhere to return to after the CCP consolidated its control and established the PRC in Beijing. Instead, they were pressed to enforce the repressive and often murderous rule of the emigre ROC in Taiwan, and often sometimes suffered violence themselves under the authoritarian KMT regime. And here in this picture is a memorial park that probably anyone who's visited Taipei has been to, commemorating one of the most uh, uh, terrifying instances of violence from the state. And even after the lifting of martial law in 1987, Taiwanese have continued to live under the ever-present threat of a new Chinese military invasion, this time from the PRC, whose leaders have pledged to eventually, quote, reunify Taiwan by any means necessary. So, subtly written into the practice of tourism, amidst all this rhetoric of reconciliation, was the recapitulation of a past military occupation and the foreshadowing of a future assault. Such semiotic excess evokes Jacques Derrida's meditation on the entwinement and tension between hospitality and hostility, in which he suggests that for the invited guest, as much as for the visitor, the crossing of the threshold always remains a transgressive step. Taiwan's thresholds are tense, tangled, and constructed through a series of transgressions. Here, tourism animates guests, hosts, and guides in a turbulent dance of difference and identity, making plain that travel is no mere leisure activity. Rather, it's a stage for struggle over ethnic identity and national borders, a geopolitical instrument and event that performs and can potentially transform state territory. So tourism, I demonstrate with this book, has been one of the several strategies aimed at achieving the political control of Taiwan for the PRC. But how has it worked in practice? And what does this case have to say to the claims of many tourism scholars and industry and political leaders that tourism can promote peace and mutual understanding? When I began this project, almost all of the scholarship on cross-strait tourism assumed an affect and effect of reconciliation and rapprochement. So these are just some examples from as early as 2006, as late as 2013, when people could have known better. And I think the top one on the left actually is from even the 90s, treating Taiwan and China as politically divided. And almost all of these articles treated Taiwan in ways actually that tourism scholars treat tourism in general, generally alighting unpleasantries of politics. And the usual treatment was one in which Taiwan and mainland China were partition states expected to somehow get along better or even unify in part through the promotion of tourism. The idea here is perhaps some holdover of a 1960s era contact hypothesis that the more people engage with each other, somehow the more they understand each other, the more they'll get along. This seemed really suspect to me, having worked in tourism with Chinese and Taiwanese people. And as far as most Chinese language scholarship was going, most accounts, be they from Taiwan or China, assumed a telos of reconciliation and focused mostly on the economic impacts of destination marketing and whatever else. Basically, how to sell Taiwan better, how to do better circuits, how to run hotels better, so on. Not much consideration as to how people might actually get along or how tourism could be weaponized. And so my book speaks back to this body of scholarship, aiming to rethink Taiwan studies, rethink cross-strait relations, but also maybe push tourism scholars and humanities and social sciences scholars to think a bit more deeply about what interaction actually does. And I did this using ethnography, using interviews, using a whole lot of observation. What was really missing from all of these past studies, apart from a much more critical discussion and history of Taiwan's unusual territoriality, was an appreciation that tourism doesn't necessarily promote reconciliation, but can serve opposing interests and produce unpredictable effects. And this sounds obvious maybe in 2023, but was not actually so obvious, I think, to many scholars in 2010. So what this book argues is that contrary to the PRC's efforts to incorporate Taiwan as part of an undivided one China, tourism actually aggravated tensions between the two polities, polarized Taiwanese society, and pushed Taiwanese popular sentiment farther towards support for national self-determination. And so in the process, Taiwan's staging of state sovereignty, which is already, frankly, a bit surreal, as I mentioned, even with just yesterday's National Day celebration, the staging of state sovereignty bifurcated into what could be described as two Taiwans. The Taiwan performed as a part of China for group tourists versus the Taiwan experienced as a site of everyday life by local residents and some independent tourists. The split corresponded with the growing fissure of domestic political economy, amplifying a conflict between those business, civil society, and state actors that had an interest in sustaining a PRC-oriented tourist industry versus those that did not. But these two tourism-inflected two Taiwans are among the most vivid manifestations of inconsistent nationalisms spanning a territory that was already realizing a distinct and, I might argue, distinctly inclusive subjectivity. Indeed, Taiwan's identity is increasingly predicated on a pluralistic civic nationalism in which not just one or two, but many Taiwans coexist more or less comfortably, even as it is existentially threatened. And of course, for as many Taiwans as there are for the Taiwanese people living here, there's that many more Taiwans being seen through the eyes of Chinese tourists as they come and have Taiwan perform for them in a variety of different ways to smooth the flow and keep the money coming, even as it causes more and more confusion and more conflict. So, although the transformations of Taiwan and China are the focus of this study, I'd like to suggest that attending to their very unusual features actually illustrates the role of everyday practices like using national flags, maps, names, and travel permits when tourism is conducted elsewhere. I think actually looking at everyday practices of state administration and interpersonal encounter in contested states, be that Taiwan or Cyprus, actually sheds light on the peculiarity of normative sovereignties more generally. And likewise, looking at exceptional and even world-shattering moments can shed light on peculiar practices long taken for granted. COVID and the pandemic and all of the mobility controls that ensued being a very clear example of this, when global mobility imploded and the geopolitical stakes of tourism, not just between China and Taiwan, but China and the world, came into full view. I took this picture in 2011 in the summer at the changing of the guards at the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall, a very popular tourist site that probably many of the viewers, listeners have been to. And here we see starched, ironed outfits, bayonets being held by ROC soldiers in front of the putative founder of the Republic of China. And there was a Chinese tourist in this scene just to the left of me when I took this photo who screamed, "This is all just for show," during a routine changing of the guards. And I observed him complain loudly to anyone who would listen before he stormed outside. Of course, he wasn't wrong. These guards were performing for show. And the monument also is a show in a way, however dilapidated it is and however gigantic and grandiose the statue of Sun Yat-sen is. And also, the tourist himself was performing in a way. But what this book, borrowing from theories of performance and performativity, would argue is that actually this theatricality makes this performance actually powerful. It's not just for show, it's not just ephemeral, it's actually productive precisely because of it's a performance. The performance between the soldiers and the tourist, just like the tourist's prior encounter with the border guard on his arrival to Taiwan and his application for a travel permit, not a passport or a visa, to enter Taiwan in the first place, produced the tourist and the toured as certain kinds of national subjects. And in so doing, it produced, reproduced, and troubled the state and interstate system. Pandemic punctuations notwithstanding, millions of tourists cross borders every year. Passports, or in the case of China and Taiwan, travel permits in hand, these tourists act as the citizen subjects of the various nation states of the world. They travel for any numbers of reasons, and when they cross borders from their own country into another and then return home, they not only carry memories and souvenirs, they, along with border agents and airlines, travel agents and tour operators, are performing, effectively enacting, and potentially transforming the borders that they cross and the territories that they traverse. I've updated this argument recently, actually, for an article about how perhaps you've all had this experience recently when you try to book an airline ticket into Taiwan on many different airlines, on many different booking agents. You actually have to put Taiwan as a province of China to get to Taipei or Kaohsiung or another destination. These travel booking engines themselves have become battlefields in the performance of Taiwan as sovereign or not. And this is always at stake, really, at pretty much every encounter that I was witnessing. And so this leads to the central idea of this book, why this book matters, not just, and I understand this is the Association of Taiwan Studies, and I'm grateful that you're listening, but why this book is, I think, relevant beyond the case of Taiwan and China. And that's its kind of key theoretical claim, which is that tourism performs and transforms state territory. And the argument here is borrows a little bit of theoretical machinery from Michel Foucault's Analytics of Government, which attend to contact between the technologies of domination of others and those of the self, which produce temporarily durable but never really finished subjects and objects. And so basically I'm suggesting, and this should be familiar to a lot of us, that states and citizens don't exist prior to their production, and territories are not passive spatial containers, but rather are effects of power-laden relationships, always in a state of flux, of becoming, of change, of contradiction, rupture, and reformation. And so to put it very concisely, tourism can and should be theorized as a technology of state territorialization. So what is territory? I don't treat territory as a place or a passive container. I treat it as acts or practices, as patterns that name, claim, calculate, and bound space, particularly the case of state territorialization, the ways that state is rendered as belonging to or bounded by a collective actor imagined as a state. And when I say imagined, I don't mean to imply that in any way this is unreal. It's often quite real and very violent, however it's imagined. And these territories, of course, attain spatial definition through the production and reproduction of borders, which establish constitutive divisions between what is inside and what is outside. And these are not simply lines on a map, but again, social and discursive practices that take place in time, that divide an inside and outside. And so if territory and territoriality kind of pivots on this distinction between inside and outside, tourism theory has also, more or less from the beginning, pivoted on a distinction between guest and host. There's an inside and outside baked into this different kind of subjects that are moving between these borders. And most early tourism theory treats tourists as typical modern subjects in search of authenticity or difference from home. The typical treatment was an American or European, seeking something authentic, seeking something real. And a lot of this wasn't really based on any kind of empirical work in Asia, which pushed back against this to argue that actually tourists in Asia, often Chinese travelers quite particularly, aren't necessarily interested in pursuing difference or authenticity. In many cases, actually, they were looking for spaces of identification and familiarity. Why perhaps you've seen, be that in Australia or Europe, so many videos of tour groups or restaurants taking Chinese tourists to Chinese restaurants, wanting a taste of home even in between visiting the Eiffel Tower or whatever else. And these studies are kind of as important, I think, for what they can tell us about Chinese tourism to Taiwan as for what they can't account for, which is this very peculiar case where Han Chinese guests identified with Taiwanese hosts as fellow ethno-nationals, even though they kind of had to admit it was a different political regime that they're actually themselves implicated in transforming, but really not quite recognizing that sense of ethno-national fellowship, that sense that they're in China with Chinese people, is often not shared by their hosts. And so in Taiwan, these kind of tricky gaps between senses or spaces of identity and difference were mediated by the guide, a professional specialist who would interpret for and translate between them, even in what sounds like the same language, but often using very tactically different language that would code territory in different ways. And so as I describe, and I'll go through chapter 4's ethnography of a Chinese group tour, which will relate a very challenging week circling Taiwan with a particular group. What tour guides are doing isn't just mimetic. They're not just telling a story over and over. They're not just staging a play, but actually they're doing creative work. They're producing real effects on tourists that have real effects on the places they return to. And so through this kind of skillful sequencing and staging, often quite masterful, the translational work of guides, along with all these props that they use, be they maps, itineraries, supporting actors, vendors, food shops, commission shops, and whatever else, don't only smoothen social differences between, say, in this case, Chinese guests and Taiwanese hosts, but actually reassemble those worlds, making new forms of communication and new forms of spaces possible. And so I coin a term called territorial translation to describe this process in more vivid detail in the chronological account of the group tour later. Speaking of guiding, I think at this point I'll start touring you around the rest of the chapters. This is what the book looks like as a table of contents. It starts with an introduction, which I just kind of worked us through, which gives a bit of history and theory to set the stage for what continues in the remainder of the book. Chapter one is something I wrote, not in the initial copy of the book, but something actually in response to a reviewer who probably is familiar to many Taiwan scholars in this room, demanded that I provide a whole chapter to narrate basically all of Taiwan's many hundreds of years of history in a way that could situate the rest of the book. I think this is probably a common frustration for Taiwan scholars, forced to use a third of a journal article to explain basic history that few other territories would be required to do. But it was actually a wonderful exercise for me to rethink Taiwan's history in terms of mobility and travel. And so I begin this chapter with a very common tale of Taiwanese students and scholars who were frustrated to be denied entry to the public spaces of the United Nations in Geneva because they didn't have a passport from a member country. It's actually funny for me to be telling this story now because in 2 days I'm going to be keynoting the Model UN, the Model United Nations conference opening ceremony for a public school in Taiwan, where students will be playing as the member countries of the UN, trying to solve public policy problems, yet doing this from a country that is not able to even have its nationals enter the public venues in Geneva, even as tourists. Which I'm afraid I'm gonna have to point out is grimly ironic on Friday. And so I use this very common account, which goes back to the 2010s and then even into 2020, of Taiwanese students and scholars who can't enter the public spaces of the UN, who've been told to go get a passport from a member country to even have to even be part of international society, to give an account of Taiwan's exceptional territoriality as a legacy of multiple waves of colonization, democratization, and diplomatic crises. And so I depict Taiwan's contemporary blue-green partisan divide between the KMT and its allies and the DPP and its allies as we now race into an election season, as well as its very odd international representation in attempts to make sense of very bewildering confections like the status quo, which is, as we know, anything but static, and also wild constructions like Chinese Taipei, the name of the sporting teams under which Taiwan is forced to compete abroad in the Olympics and elsewhere, even in its own territory. For example, in 2017, during a summer universiade, a college, international college competition, when Taiwan's own team competed as Chinese Taipei, when the materials that the host country and the host association produced to let guests know where they were, referred to Taiwan itself as Chinese Taipei, saying the capital of Chinese Taipei is Taipei, saying that Chinese Taipei is an island with hundreds of kilometers from north to south, to make this very wild case and explain how we get to the point where we're at today. And so I translate, for example, this wonderful pithy quote from the journalist Chris Horton: why reporting on Taiwan isn't easy in one photo. Taiwanese audience in Republic of China Afrowigs cheer the arrival of Team Chinese Taipei. I translate this analytically as follows. A people with a consolidated national identity are administered by a dislocated state apparatus that anachronistically shares the territorial referent of the irredentist power that replaced it. It's symbolically figured by a nationality, Chinese, to which only a dwindling minority subscribes, and imagine to live in a city, Taipei, which is not inhabited by a majority of the island's residents. So the so-called status quo is a very strange kind of status indeed. And this all sets the stage for the next chapter, chapter 2, which provides a history of mobility or the lack thereof between Taiwan and China. First during the Cold War and martial law eras, and then following the 1987 and 88 openings of limited travel in both directions. And I described in this chapter how the Chen Shui-bian administration had actually attempted to open up to Chinese tourists, but was thwarted by a PRC that collaborated with the KMT to bring back the latter to power under a different leadership and nationalist ideology under this catchphrase, the 92 consensus, which is yet another kind of performative phrase. 92 consensus, at least in the KMT's understanding, one China, each with its own interpretation, was the rhetorical basis for China-Taiwan political relations, including tourism, during the presidency of Ma Ying-jeou from 2008 to 2016. And here on the left, we see a 20th anniversary of this event. On the right, we see Ma and Xi meeting in Singapore in 2015, 2 years before I moved there. And the 92 consensus was a diplomatic fiction, referring to the apocryphal outcome of a series of meetings between quasi-official, not elected representatives of the PRC and the ROC in 1992. And these meetings didn't produce any jointly written statements. There was no declaration afterwards. But later, ROC representatives, all of whom had belonged to the KMT, claimed they agreed with their counterparts that both sides of the Taiwan Strait belonged to one country called China, with each side allowed a different interpretation of what China is. And the PRC, for its part, never acknowledged the own interpretations, the Gebiao part of this formation, even if the KMT frequently cited it. So the Ma administration constantly cited this so-called consensus to maintain an actually exceptional status quo, but it also fueled popular suspicion that forces on both sides, both in Taiwan and China, plan to use state and market mechanisms, including tourism, to enact political unification with or likelier annexation by the PRC. And so the 2008 opening of direct flights and an explosion of tourism, both in terms of capital investment and human traffic, were probably the most visible outcomes of this cross-strait political cooperation, or conniving, depending on your point of view. So indeed, by 2010, Chinese tourists jumped from minimal to very quickly surpass Japanese to become the top inbound segment in Taiwan. And this made a lot of money for some people, although those revenues were not widely shared, as I discuss in detail. Chapter 3 tours Taiwan, tours the reader around Taiwan. It goes from the National Palace Museum to the Shilin Night Market to Taidong's Dulan, and it treats Taiwan's national iconography as a field of paradoxes for both residents and visitors. When Chinese tourists arrived, whatever their feelings and education about Taiwan's sovereignty, they were immediately confronted with the official regalia of the ROC, a state the PRC holds to be illegitimate. So when they depart, for example, as I show in this photo from Shanghai, and this is a photo I took myself joining the Chinese tour group, they see Taiwan depicted not as international, but as part of a formation of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, the sort of simulated regional formation, which I write about elsewhere in a geography journal. But as soon as they land in Taiwan, actually, if they're paying attention, they see, for example, that destinations in China, Shanghai, Hongqiao, or Chengdu and Sichuan, are represented as international within Taiwan airports. They're forced to enter the ROC immigration line and whatever else when they get to Taiwan. So they're confronted with these paradoxes, which produce this kind of sense of exceptional or maybe even a multiple or overlapping sovereignty or national character. And this is further compromised or compounded when Taiwanese independence activists dispute the legitimacy of not just China, but even the ROC's claims to Taiwan. But still, many Chinese tourists insist to me in interviews that they felt like they were still in China in some way. And this production was really especially effective for group tourists who usually said they felt that they were still there, not just because of official territorial claims, but because state and industry actors in Taiwan shaped, narrated, and translated their experiences in ways that made it seem more familiar than it might be otherwise. So there's some places, for example, the National Palace Museum, that really put the Chineseness front and center. But other places like Dulan in Taidong, which have a much more indigenous vibe, where I would meet not just locals, but even Chinese tourists who might say things to me like they felt like they were in an island in the Pacific. So all of this leads me to borrow yet another Foucauldian concept of heterotopia, but more colorfully, I borrow from the speculative fiction book of the wonderful author China Mieville, The City in the City, which posits two city-states that belong to two different nations in juridical realms, but are actually interlaced throughout the same physical space. And so I borrow from this wonderful scenario to think through this overlap and disjuncture of Taiwan of its residents and the Taiwan of its Chinese tourists. So in the novel, the space is divided into total or alter, either one or the other, in the case of, for example, my example, it would be either very Chinese or very Taiwanese, but also crosshatch areas where the cities converge to share roads or train lines and buildings. And on the edges between these cities, and even on different floors of the same buildings, citizens train themselves to see and sense what is domestic and to unsee and unsense what is foreign. But car crashes, gas explosions, mentally ill attackers, and other border perforating catastrophes can throw this careful unseeing into sudden disarray, provoking confusion or worse. And so Taiwan, I suggest, the Taiwan lived by its residents, and the Taiwan fabricated for Chinese tourists are performed or were performed as two different nations that intersected and interlaced within the same coordinates. The first Taiwan was simply Taiwan as a lived space, socially distinct, politically de facto independent, but largely due to Chinese pressure, diplomatically unrecognized by most of the world. And the second Taiwan was an indivisible part of China, an irredentist fantasy land sketched by PRC rhetoric, perceived by a dwindling number of ROC partisans, and performed by complicit parts of the Taiwanese tourist industry. And that these two Taiwans are the same Taiwan is a social surreality that its residents are really adept at living with. So some tourist circuits overlapped with residential areas and some didn't. As I mentioned, the National Palace Museum, Gugong or Kending became so crowded, a beach resort became so crowded as to provoke resentment from locals and dissuade them from visiting. I had locals tell me things like they don't want to go to Kending. If they wanted to go to China, they would just go to China. And they certainly didn't want to go to the National Palace Museum and line up with Chinese tourists. But there are a lot of other places I visited, as you'll see in subsequent slides, including stores operated by the KMT itself and CD commission shopping museums that were out of the way and easy enough for most Taiwanese to ignore. So to make sense of this, I borrow not only from Nievel's work on the city and the city, but also Foucault's notion of a heterotopia, which points to spaces that are in relation with other sites, but suspect or neutralize or invert or juxtapose sites in ways that throw all of them into question. And a very obvious example of this, and the one that made the cover of the book, is right here at Taipei 101. I took this photo in 2014, and as you can see, there's a whole lot of different flags right here in this scene in front of what was the world's tallest skyscraper and is, was maybe still be one of Taiwan's highest end malls. The tourists here are from China, holding up not only a PRC flag, but also an ROC flag, taking photos for each other, but also for the quite likely paid agents of the so-called Concentric Patriotism Association of the ROC, who would go and stage demonstrations there against the Falun Gong, a dissident religious group banned in China that accuses the PRC of all kinds of human rights abuses, who would demonstrate there day after day, targeting Chinese tourists, not only in Taiwan, but you've probably seen them in Australia as well, perhaps in Bali, Thailand, or anywhere that Chinese tourists go. Falun Gong demonstrators are always demonstrating, showing pictures of atrocities and calling on the tourists to drop out of the Communist Party or to lose faith in the regime. So here's a scene that had Chinese tourists. It had Falun Gong demonstrators demonstrating against Chinese tourists, or not against, but on their behalf for them. Meanwhile, a Chinese nationalist group composed of Taiwanese nationals and some immigrants from China, marriage migrants from China to Taiwan, demonstrating, singing Chinese communist songs, accusing the Falun Gong of being an evil cult, taking photos with Chinese tourists. This is what's on the left. And then on the right, yet another group that would show up to counter-demonstrate against this, the Taiwan Independence Revolutionary Army, whose flags you can see on the bottom right, saying things like Taiwan independence. They would play songs in Taiyu and Hokkien, and they would counter-demonstrate against the Chinese, the pro-PRC demonstrators. And so there's at least 3 different groups demonstrating in such a way that even the Chinese tourists, even the Taiwanese locals didn't know who was who. I would go there day after day observing this, and it was such a cacophony that it seemed as if multiple countries were existing in the same place, protesting each other on behalf of tourists. And so we can get this real sense of exceptional multiple or overlapping sovereignties right in this commercial center, with Taipei 101 spotlighted in name and on the cover of the book. And this scene in this whole chapter, which tours the reader through Taiwan, sets the stage for the centerpiece of the book, which is a nearly diaristic account of what was maybe one of the worst weeks of my life. It was circling Taiwan with a tour group from Shanghai and surrounds. And here you can see tour buses in Hualien, some of the tourists not from my own group, but from nearby. And again, no surprise, a Falun Gong banner against one of the cars. I put this map up on the right to give you a sense of where we started, of course, in Taoyuan Airport, going down the west coast, all the way down to Kunding. We were told we would stay in Kunding, but we actually stayed in a nearby town called Chechang. There were many things in the itinerary that were misleading. That was just one of them. We were supposedly staying in Taidong. Instead, we stayed in Changong. Many ways for the tour operator to save money as we circle around and visit commission shop after commission shop. The tour guide sang a little ditty to me and whoever was listening. 上厕睡觉，下厕尿尿，回家什么都不知道. Get on the coach and sleep. Get off the coach and pee. Go home knowing nothing. He said this to me towards the end of the tour, which I took in August 2014. And this tour was a very kind of typical low to mid budget package tour, about 900 US dollars. I think it was about close to 6,000 RMB, including round trip airfare from Shanghai to Taiwan, hotel accommodation, most meals, and mandatory shopping trips. It was really hard to get on this tour in the first place. I went from travel agent to travel agent in Shanghai asking who would take me. I don't have a Chinese passport. I have a US passport. Most of them had never taken someone on such a tour to Taiwan. And they said I couldn't go unless perhaps I was going with a spouse or something. They said it was against the rules. They wouldn't show me the rules. Eventually, I found a company that would take me and has been now an unexceptional as possible a company, which was ideal really for this research purpose. Because after 8 days of incredibly tedious touring, the guide's ditty was really ringing true. But after getting on and off the bus again and again and again, I realized that the trip's medium, and of course its tedium, was its message. Its design and conduct, especially at its most banal and repetitive, had a very straightforward territorial effect of producing China and Taiwan. It was just like any other Chinese group tour, but transposed to Taiwan in ways that didn't really exist before this industry had exploded. But there were some really peculiar features, like being taken to a jade shop run by the KMT itself, where we were told that the more outrageously priced jewelry we would buy, the faster Taiwan and China would unify. We saw, for example, Mainzhou on a tea box. Somehow, this is incredibly extravagantly priced tea at a tea shop in Alishan, where the owner bragged about his political connections, said all kinds of lewd things to me about his sales girls, and then paraded around these overpriced Mainzhou tea boxes. I have no idea if Ma got a commission or not off of these, but it was really quite striking. And it wasn't only Ma, other sorts of KMT heroes appeared throughout at these commission shops, which is what was really paying for the tour. If any of you have gone on a tour in China, you might be aware that often these tours run at a loss. The hotels are very low priced. The tour guides themselves are making very low salaries. What pays for this is going shopping after shopping after shopping after shopping at places that are nominally tour sites, so-called museums, so-called memorial centers. In this case, we went supposedly to a shop where we would, supposedly a jade museum, but was in fact a jade shop owned and operated by some branch of the KMT. Probably has been divested since the ill-gotten party assets law was passed in 2016 and 17. But in this case, we see two jade vases that had been handed from a pan blue leader to Hu Jintao, as well as a piece of rose quartz. And we were told that we should buy two of these vases because Heping Tongyi, with two vases, you have a homophony, you have a pun in which peace, vase, and peaceful reunification can exist together in a way that somehow the company thought would stimulate sales. And we should also buy vases that are 1 meter and 92 centimeters tall, 1 meter for one China, 92 centimeters for the 92 consensus. So a lot of very creative cases of not just using economics to pursue politics, to 一经促政, but to 议政促经, to use political excuses to make a profit in ways that actually my tourists saw right through. Other very extraordinary examples of this were in Taipei, where we went to one of the few explicitly, or at least honestly, co-invested shops between China and Taiwan. In this case, a pineapple cake company, Vigor Kobo, that also proudly displayed photos of the then KMT mayor Hao Longbin and the former KMT mayor and then KMT president Ma Ying-jeou.
我有听到，
他在那边录的了，
跟我们这个没关系。
So speaking of Ma Ying-jeou, chapter 5 moves from this gruesome group tour, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A, to the accounts of various independent tourists. And it begins with the account of Han Han, who was China's most famous blogger, at the time at least, who posted a very widely read piece about how great his trip to Taiwan was. He lost his phone in his cab. He needed new glasses at a glass shop, and they couldn't produce them on time. But the shop gave him a free pair for the weekend, and the cabbie then went and found him at his hotel and handed his phone back to him. And he writes in this blog post quite eloquently that this is unthinkable in China, that people don't behave in this way, that China is so backwards that all trust has been lost because of the misrule of the CCP, and that he needs to thank Taiwan and Hong Kong for preserving Chinese culture. That because Chinese culture has been so well taken care of and nurtured by Taiwan's regime, that this is why people are so nice and so honest, and why he got his phone back. This is really quite an extraordinary reading, and not one actually that was that uncommon among many of the people that I interviewed, who found Taiwanese better behaved, Taiwan's streets cleaner, Taiwan's general environment more pleasant, because they thought it was somehow more Chinese. They didn't. There's many, of course, other interpretations for why, but many of them, as exemplified by Han Han, found this to be persuasive. I contrast this account with that of a young art student I met in Shanghai before her trip to Taiwan. I spent a couple summers in Shanghai doing groundwork to get over to Taiwan on this group tour, but also to meet tourists prior to their trip to get a sense of what they were thinking, how they were planning, and then to stay in touch with them through their time. And so this particular tourist texted me throughout her trip about how she got exposed to forbidden knowledge. When she was in Taipei, she went to the 24-hour bookstore, then 24 hours, Esli Chengping, where she went to a talk by a Hong Kong University professor about the dissident artist Ai Weiwei, pictured here on the right. And her reflections sounded almost too neat to be true. More than Han's account, which basically recapitulated a very conventional story about Taiwan as a pure part of China, what this particular tourist, who I named Yuping, experienced could be spun as an example of a very bad nightmare for the CCP, a sign that tourists, independent tourists at least, might find their way into scenes and spaces that could subvert hegemonic narratives. But her tale was one of many that I recount in this chapter, which really focuses as much on ambiguity and contradiction as it does on very coherent or progressive stories of awakening or uncovering a hidden truth. You know, I interviewed, for example, a lot of family tourists at the airport, people who just went to see their, in many cases, their daughters or cousins who married into Taiwan. And many of these tourists just wanted to have a family catch up and weren't really thinking about politics. But of course, politics did explode into full view during this time, particularly in 2014, with the outbreak of the sunflower movement in Taiwan, and then later the Hong Kong umbrella movements, both of which I conducted participant observation in which I think through in this chapter through the lens of tourism, which in the case of the sunflower movement was the movement was prompted as a protest against a trade deal between Taiwan and China, which included provisions that would have liberalized tourism. Tourism was not being discussed very much by sunflower activists who were more concerned about other aspects of this trade deal, but it was certainly on the mind of some of its most prominent leaders, as you can see here in this quote from Lin Feifan, and a similar quote from another leader, Chen Wei-ting, that observed that tourism was in that treaty. In the case of Hong Kong, Hong Kongers were protesting for universal suffrage to elect their own chief executive, but there was a whole lot of anti-tourist sentiment visible on the streets of Hong Kong, both in posted slogans, but also the way people were speaking, as I narrate in this chapter. And so I narrate both of these movements and then lead into the 2014 election and then the 2016 election which brought the TPP to power not only locally in a number of cities where it's quite surprising, but also nationally, not just the presidency, but for the first time with the legislature, which had never happened, which led to President Tsai's disavowal of the 92 consensus, the announcement of a new southbound policy, which was in part designed to bring in tourists from other places like Southeast Asia, anticipating that Chinese tourists would stop coming. It also describes how Chinese tourists, their numbers fell off a cliff not unexpectedly. China started first clamping down on group tour companies selling tours to Taiwan, and then reducing the number of permits issued for Chinese tourists to come to Taiwan, first for group tours and then for independent tourists, which led to something unprecedented as well, was 10,000 tourism workers taking to the streets of Taipei for a first ever protest. This happened in September 2016, and it was organized and publicized by a variety of industry groups, including the Tourism Industry Self-Help Association, the Mainland Tourist Bus Drivers Alliance, the Travel Agent Association. These are associations whose leaders I've interviewed actually earlier when they were more hopeful about their industry. And even some really oddball groups I'd never heard of, the Taiwan Beef Noodle Soup Association. And I joined them for a walk from Huashan, 1914 Cultural District, a place I hung out 20 years prior when it was more a scene of hipster art events. I walked with them to the presidential office through the rain, donning this free stenciled white t-shirt and a white hat. And you can see to the right of my hat, a sign saying, welcome mainland tourists to Taiwan. There were pre-printed banners that didn't quite call for the one China principle, but they, at least not by name, but they used the 92 consensus over and over, as Chinese readers can see on these banners. Support the 92 consensus. It's the will of the people, and so on. Other signs like the two sides of the Taiwan Strait belong to the same family, Liang'an, Yijiaqin, and so on. And everyone I talked to, 20 people plus, guides, drivers, office staff, and more, insisted that their primary goal was to press President Tsai to accept the one China principle and the 92 consensus in order to rescue their industry. And they said they didn't print these positions on the signs or call for them in the speeches because they didn't want to appear too political. This protest got all kinds of coverage in in China. It was all over the news, in print and TV and online. And this position, while it was sort of loud on the streets here, was very much in the national minority. China's cuts certainly hurt the livelihood of Taiwanese tour guides, but with the tourism industry in Taiwan accounting for a very small amount of its GDP, relative to other countries in the world, it's something ranked like, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council, in 2016, it was somewhere in 140 out of 180 countries in terms of tourism's relative importance to the economy, compared to something like Macau or Thailand towards the top. So that this cross-strait media storm occurred despite tourism's relatively small contribution to the economy, I think really underscores its uncanny political salience. And Taiwanese netizens reacted in very different ways with these sorts of signs. Online activists and designers producing mock ads saying things like "Welcome to Taiwan without Chinese," showing idyllic sunsets, quiet scenes, temple confetti, cherry blossoms, and the like, circulating on PTT, a Taida bulletin board, and all over the internet, in fact, causing the Tourism Bureau to disclaim these as unreal and not to be supported. In the meantime, KMT officials actually went so far as to fly to China to try to rescue their cities and counties, and to do what they called a self-help relief mission to restart tourism from China to their places. And they actually reached agreements with Chinese officials and tour companies to market trips only to counties and cities that elected KMT or aligned politicians who had avowed support for the 92 consensus. And they actually called this tour the 92 Consensus Tour, where they could experience the new Taiwan, which is pretty hard to do because Taoyuan was the main airport was controlled by the DPP. They'd have to fly in and do a strange half donut around Taiwan, which produced two Taiwans and yet a very different kind of sense. Is quite wild. Didn't sell very well, but it's really, I think, symbolically significant that this could happen at all, especially that these meetings could happen between the KMT officials and officials in China in this way is really quite striking. But still, with Tsai's landslide re-election 4 years later, because these efforts didn't quite work, it looked as if the more plural of the two Taiwans had eclipsed the other in the face of the red sun across the strait. Yet just a few weeks later, in this gray zone between open hostility and peaceful friction, the region and the wider world were rocked by a new force, not a local catastrophe like bus crashes or weird protests at Taipei 101, but the cataclysm of COVID-19, which brought all cross-strait traffic to a standstill and thrust Chinese tourism and Taiwan's contested sovereignty to the center of world attention. And so in the epilogue, I describe this episode and go on to conclude that as much as tourism served to signify China's global integration, its conduct remained constrained by the geopolitical imperatives of its party states, and that tourism didn't achieve political unification with Taiwan and actually provoked a backlash instead, illuminates the limits and contradictions between tourism's intertwined instrumentalities for capital accumulation and state territorialization. And the COVID-19 pandemic not only effectively ended cross-strait tourism, but as we all know, put all of tourism around the world on hiatus for several years. And although Taiwan has come out relatively unscathed from the pandemic, and actually in many ways has been celebrated, and actually its relative success was again a major theme of yesterday's National Day speeches, it is in as geopolitically precarious position as ever. Now, as we race into a new election. And with that, I'd like to end the formal part of the book talk by just observing that Taiwan's spaces for realizing new ways of being in the world are produced in part by being so precarious and contested and by being so in between. The same is true for Hong Kong, where this in-betweenness afforded an impossible challenge, but also a sense of perhaps emancipatory potential. And so in this respect, the fate of these two territories converged in some ways, even if the prescription designed for both one country, two systems, which has been imposed on Hong Kong and originally designed for Taiwan, in fact, has diverged, if not collapsed completely. It has no market anymore in Taiwan. So, mobilities between Taiwan and China, like mobilities anywhere, are being refashioned post-pandemic in a world in which tourism will continue to simultaneously serve and destabilize the interests of capital and territory. Its valences of geopolitical, environmental, and social insecurity ever more visible. And beyond Taiwan and China, as other regions form and reform, and as bodies and capital reconfigure states and nations, as rising tides and changing climates reshape borders between land and sea, tourism's capacities to perform and transform territory will rearticulate in destinations yet to be realized. And with that, I end the talk, and I welcome questions and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ian. That was fascinating. I really like this idea of using tourism to see how territory is performed, how it's performed through tourism, especially in Taiwan with Chinese tourism, and I guess a little bit about Taiwanese tourism in mainland China. So we can open the floor to questions. If you have a question, can you please use the function to raise your hand or just turn on your video and literally raise your hand. Now we can start out with, there's one in the chat box. Tets, do you want to read out your question? No. Okay, I'll do it for you. So Tets, okay, fair enough. So Tets Kimura is, he works at Flinders University in Adelaide. And he's part of our Taiwan Studies Association. So he said, Japanese airlines abolished the country category for East Asian destinations. You choose the region of East Asia, then choose a destination, city, airport, Seoul, Hong Kong, Beijing, Qantas does not do this. So that's more of a statement on that. Yeah.
I'm
Do
happy
you
to
want
speak to that a little bit. Yeah. Thanks, Tess, for that observation. Different countries and different airlines, as you observe, have reacted very differently to direct letters, sometimes from Chinese authorities, but also sometimes from Chinese corporations, or also sometimes massive social media campaigns, for example, against fashion brands that would uh, symbolize Taiwan in particular ways on maps. This happened to was it LV, Prada, someone else in the last couple of years. In the case of Japanese airlines that you're talking about, yeah, abolishing country is one approach that's been done there and elsewhere. Other places have used country slash region or country slash territory to get around this. So Singapore, for example, has done that. Maybe region, territory. Other places replace it with city. But it is wildly inconsistent, and that you observe that Qantas has not followed the Japanese approach is significant.
Hallam, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk, Ian. Very enjoyable. I was just wondering whether you could say, and maybe this is a little bit outside of the scope of your book, but I'm curious about kind of, I guess, about how the PRC kind of imagined what was going to happen here, right? You talked a little bit about the kind of the sort of general imagination in kind of tourism studies about, kind of more people meet up and there's going to be kind of more understanding. But I was wondering about whether you have any thoughts about what the kind of PRC's kind of model or theory is here for, throwing all these tourists into Taiwan, and that somehow this will help to kind of undermine Taiwanese sovereignty, or how did they imagine that was going to happen, or even did they take I was wondering whether they took even any further steps towards selecting certain types of tourists that they thought would be particularly kind of influential, or anything along those lines. So just wondering about what you think their kind of approach to this was. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Alan, for the question. First off, as far as the way tourism selection or eligibility proceeded, actually, the sending to Taiwan was very similar to the sending to earlier destinations in Europe and elsewhere, starting with first-tier cities and group tourists. So Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, or Shenzhen tourists had first crack at entering Taiwan. And then second-tier cities were opened up, and then independent tourists. And that's not unique to Taiwan. I suspect that several tourists, high-profile tourists, for example, Han Han, and certainly some explicitly political tourists, for example, representatives of PRC government bodies, the Taiwan Affairs Office, and so on, were very carefully briefed and prepared. But I don't think the same is true for the vast majority of leisure travelers, who, as far as I can tell, and I have to do some degree of mind reading, but also reading of people who work on political economy in the cross-strait context. So the works of Scott Kastner, the works of Shirley Lin, and so on, that analyze the use of economic means to pursue political ends. So in this case, making the Taiwanese tourism industry, including hotels, travel agents, tour guides, drivers, and however else, as dependent as possible on revenues from China to produce economic dependence, and thereby further gain leverage over Taiwanese voters and Taiwanese industry. And we could see the fruits of that paying off somewhat in the photo I showed of the 2016 protest, where many of those people were out in the streets providing very useful coverage for Chinese journalists, which again didn't have that much of an impact on Taiwanese voters or general citizens, but was I think useful for the home audience in China. I suspect it's hard to know if PRC leaders understood how chaotic and poorly implemented so much of the tourism growth would be in Taiwan. I can tell you because I was able to I couldn't interview PRC leaders. They're not available for this, but I was able to interview a number of tourism officials within Taiwan, both state officials, but also travel industry representatives who made themselves very available and were fairly upfront about their political ties. Many of them were KMT aligned. And some of them had even gone to China in 2006 as part of party-to-party talks to help set the ground for this opening of tourism. But many of them even were shocked by how shoddy the opening was, by how many people came so quickly, how hotels were of such poor quality, how public spaces were so rapidly overrun. One person I quote in the book complained that the National Palace Museum should be run by Ding Tai Fung, the dumplings restaurant, which would do a much better job of managing crowds. He's absolutely right, you know. So I think that came as a shock even to KMT leaders and even in the tourism industry's boosters in Taiwan. So I can only suspect that Chinese officials didn't really know what they were getting into, and that they might in fact provoke a backlash in Taiwan. They certainly should have known better in the case, for example, of Hong Kong, where they have much better intelligence. You know, it's been their territory for years, but it took until the umbrella movement and advocacy from Beijing-aligned parties. I'm thinking here of Michael Tian of the Liberal Party in Hong Kong, before the numbers of tourists from China to Hong Kong started getting limited. So I suspect the PRC leadership didn't then and still doesn't really have that great a sense of what's happening on the ground in Taiwan. And that thinking just at a very high level of producing economic dependence to pursue a political goal was probably informing their thinking more than anything.
Okay. Oh, all right, Phyllis.
Hi, Ian. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I'm more interested in independent tourists because you have one chapter about independent tourists and you talk about their different impression about Taiwan and what they observe differently from a group tourist. And recently, I think more and more independent tourists post recordings in social media, in online social media, talking about their experience in Taiwan. The most recent one may be Sean. I don't know whether you know this person or not. He recently posted a lot of recordings about his trip experience in Taiwan, and they are actually very popular among Taiwanese. Yeah, so and I feel that more and more Taiwanese are more friendly with this independent Chinese tourists. So do you think this independent tourist would be like play the key role to change Taiwanese people's impression about China?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So independent tourists went all over Taiwan. They engaged in a very wide variety of ways. The research I did was very much ethnographic and interview based. I didn't conduct any large scale polls of their views of Taiwan, nor of Taiwanese people's views of independent tourists. So I can only give you fairly anecdotal information and say that, well, first off, please send me that reference that you're just talking about, Sean, wherever those videos are. If you could put that in the chat box, I'd love to review those later. What I would say is that a lot of Taiwanese, I spoke with a number of Taiwanese and also international residents of Taiwan who hosted independent Chinese tourists at their Airbnbs or at their hostels or otherwise. And I think, like Taiwanese people in general feelings about Chinese people was one of, these are perfectly nice, normal people, you know, like they're perfectly nice guests. Chinese people generally had, in speaking with them, and I think based on polls, a generally positive impression of independent tourists. They were thought to spend more money. They were thought to be more polite. They were thought to be from higher educational, higher class backgrounds, thought to behave better, make less of a mess than large bust around tour groups and so on. I never got the sense that changed Taiwanese as people's thoughts about sovereignty or cultural difference. It was simply that it was nice for them to engage with people in this warm yet somewhat transactional way. You know, people are spending for the hotel room or for the food, have a perfectly pleasant interaction like they might with a Japanese or a French person, and then send them home. It didn't change their sense of how Taiwan should or should not politically engage with China. If anything, it seemed to the more Taiwanese engaged with Chinese people, the more they felt difference. Conversely, the more Chinese tourists engaged, and this is again based on interviews, the more they felt similarity, the more they felt like they were talking to someone who could be their cousin, the more they felt like Taiwan was culturally part of China, even if it was politically different. There were places where all this kind of not necessarily broke down, but became more colorful or more interesting. For example, in sites like Dulan, so in Taidong, this indigenous Amis village that's become very popular with international backpackers, but also Chinese backpackers at that time. And I was sitting in a cafe performance space where an indigenous Rukai singer, actually someone who performed later in the Sunflower Movement, Dakanao, was singing indigenous music. And then another indigenous singer welcomed our friends from Dalu, welcomed our friends from mainland China, something like our Zhongguo Dalu Tongbao, something like that, only to be corrected by the proprietor of the shop, who is a second generation Waisang, mainlander, but Taiwanese, who corrected him saying, "We welcome our Chinese guests to Taiwan." So everyone was sort of taking a stand. And in the meantime, I went and interviewed one of those Chinese guests and asked her what she thought of it, what she thought of Taiwan. And she said simply, Taiwan is an island in the Pacific, which is this is the kind of thing that only a very savvy Chinese tourist who'd spent time in a place like Dulan or among Taiwan independence activists would even think to say. Because a more typical response was, from a lot of independent tourists I got, more common response was something like, yeah, Taiwan and China are politically different, but we all have the same blood. It's probably good for now because the CCP is kind of bad. Maybe it's good that Taiwan's independent for now, but in 20 or 30 years, Taiwan and China should unify, especially when there's a world war between China and the US. Taiwanese people will feel in their bloods that they're really Chinese. And therefore, it's good that we're here now so we can get to know each other better for this coming global race war. I heard this from several people. So all of this is to give you a somewhat long-winded answer, which is that I couldn't draw general conclusions about the impressions or the impacts of independent tourists on the China-Taiwan relationship. There's a little bit of research on this that uses more quantitative approaches, polling Chinese tourists, for example, calling them in China, but I'm very suspicious of that work as well, because I suspect that most respondents are very wary of any polling coming out of Taiwan. I'm likewise wary of similar kinds of polls conducted in Taiwan. So the best I can say is that in the language of the book, if tourism is a technology of state territorialization, independent tourism is a very disorganized and unclosable sort of technology for that.
Good answer. Is that okay, Phyllis, or did you have a follow-up, or can I follow on from that? Because I'm interested in something similar, but how things have changed for the group tourists over a similar kind of period. A line that jumped out at me that I think jumped out at Hallam as well. You said that for the people studying tourism, this kind of tourism, they assumed an affect and effect of reconciliation. So they believed that it was all going to be positive. And you said in today's talk and in your book, they should have known better. And yeah, this seems so obvious because for most of us, tourism creates stereotypes, negative stereotypes, right? It's not just in East Asia. When I was a kid, there was a stereotype about Americans running around saying I'm an American citizen everywhere. That this has lingered on for decades, even though I don't think an American has said that many decades. Or Japanese people with cameras was a negative stereotype. British drunken football hooligans, Canadians and Kiwis with flags. But what was different about Chinese tourists? I mean, this happened everywhere, but much more so in China when negative stereotypes about Chinese tourists started bouncing around. There was absolute horror in China that some of their compatriots could be traveling around and producing these negative stereotypes and behaving badly. So much anger about this. and a lot of energy was put into changing and pressuring these people when you're abroad. Do a good job of representing your country, and it actually worked. So the Chinese tourists around the world tried much harder, and I guess every citizen did, but the Chinese much more so. So did you see? I mean, this was kind of over the period you studied. So did you see a change over that period, and did that change have any meaning, or was it far too late?
It's funny you mentioned all that. Indeed, there have been campaigns to civilize Chinese tourists because they've been portrayed as ambassadors of the country. The scholar Jenny Chiu has written about this, and this was happening well before the tourists came to Taiwan for the period of my research. There's a very funny video I relate in the group tour chapter where as soon as we landed in the Taoyuan airport, and the tour guide comes on and greets us as and me too, as VIPs from southern China, and starts using words like our premier Wen Jiabao couldn't come to Taiwan, so you're here for him. He then played, which was incredible to hear a man from Tainan speak in this way. He played a video that had been produced by Taiwan's government showing a black bear, like it's a Formosan black bear, and other icons of Taiwan, or people dressed up as this, giving advice to tourists on how to act in more civilized ways. So actually, the Taiwan government adopted similar kinds of rhetoric about not littering and so on. Slightly different tenor than what we saw in China, but close enough. And written in Fantizi and kind of playing up the Taiwanese elements, using cuter kinds of language, and Taiwanese accents that were really quite distinctive from that of most of the tourists coming in. There was a ton of reports in Taiwan of bad tourist behavior, people defacing plants in parks, people misusing toilets, and so on. The tenor of this that I saw was rarely quite as the stuff coming out of Hong Kong that was complaining about Chinese tourists, referring to them as locusts, and using very animalizing language. That I never saw anything that reached quite that tenor in Taiwan, at least not as concentrated. I don't think I was able to observe in the course of this many years of filter for this book any really measurable change in tourist bad behavior. I think that the number of reports circulated independently of whatever campaigns were being done in China to make tourists behave better in Taiwan. I didn't get the sense that tourists were particularly trained to behave better in Taiwan to promote cross-strait relations, beyond actually some real explicit training, some real explicit instructions that were received by a number of guides and some tourists. For example, what guides would receive, the Chinese side would receive, was don't talk about Taiwan and China. You can talk about Beijing and Taipei. Don't talk about Taiwan and China. You can talk about Taiwan and mainland China. Don't talk about the false flag. These sorts of trainings that were done for tour directors in China, although not tour guides within Taiwan. But I couldn't really appreciate a measurable change in tourist behavior that was noticed by Taiwanese people. I think even if there was a particular change in the so-called civilizedness of these particular tourists, it would have been overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of other tourists coming in. Say you have 500,000 very well-behaved tourists, and then suddenly 1 million more pop up in the course of the next year or two, which is what happened. I think that would overwhelm any sort of education campaign that would be conducted in the PRC.
Okay, thanks for that. Beyond the education campaign, I was thinking also of the shame factor, which I think might agree would probably even more influential than any sort of government effort. Other questions? Anybody else in the room have a question for Ian? No. Okay. Shall we, Lennon, turning on your camera to say something? No? Okay, I won't put you on the spot then.
Well, just a quick comment. While you was talking about the education, I would say most of the times it's more like I shouldn't use the word, but I will use the word the brainwash. They've been educated when they were kids about the situation of between Taiwan and China, and when they come to Taiwan, they might behave in certain ways rather than the government purposely educate them to do something. That's what I feel. But no, I don't have any question.
You know, when you see your whole life that Taiwan is a part of China on maps, when you see Taiwan produced, you see an image of Sun Moon Lake on the Taiwan page of your PRC passport. When all this happens, yeah, you might have particular fantasies about Taiwan. One of the craziest independent tourist stories in my book, I interviewed someone who was well-educated, college graduate from Shenzhen, came here as an independent leisure tourist, who had visited the presidential office, which you're almost certainly aware was a Japanese colonial building, office of Governor General, and then taken over the president of Taiwan, or the ROC. This tourist had no idea that Taiwan had been a Japanese colony. She somehow thought that Taiwan had belonged to the ROC since there was an ROC. And I'm sure she's not the only tourist like this. There's really a shocking divergence in understandings of Taiwan coming from China that sometimes was ameliorated by their visit here and sometimes not at all. I'm sure many people went back to China thinking much the same.
Well, for someone like me,
sorry, go ahead.
I mean, for someone like me in my age, we experienced that as a Taiwanese, that they kind of brainwashed, and you believe what the government says is true, and all the materials you studied are sort of censored. So coming from the kind of idea or the period, I can sort of understand why most of the Chinese people have different fantasies or ideas about Taiwan. And when they come to Taiwan, it's become, well, maybe a culture shock or something that they don't feel comfortable with.
Yeah, and also one that allows them, in the case of Han Han and others, to reflect on China, not just to maybe experience cognitive dissonance around what Taiwan is, but they also see China through a very different lens because of how they've been taught about Taiwan, and also how Taiwan presents or doesn't present itself as Chinese.
Can I? Okay, just some observation, because I did some research about 陆生 Chinese students in Taiwan, and quite a lot of research saying something like after they stay in Taiwan for a period of time and find that Taiwanese actually don't share the kind of Chineseness Chinese students have. These Chinese students turn like more Chinese nationalist. Yeah. So do you see the similar situation in like the tourists, Chinese tourists, after they found that perhaps they are not that welcome in Taiwan?
I think the vast majority of group tourists were oblivious to how Taiwanese people saw them. The vast majority of them described Taiwanese as warm, as polite, and generous and accommodating, and used often kind of feminizing, if not patronizing terms for them. I think they rarely, the group tourists rarely sense that kind of perception of difference on the Taiwanese part, or in some cases, political resentment. So I think actually no. I think 8 days, especially in such a carefully stage managed production of shop to shop to hotel to hotel to restaurant, insulated tourists from that sense of alienation. I wish there was more research on what you're talking about with students. I know Wang Honglin, sociologist, and a couple others are doing it, but I wish there was more, because the numbers of Chinese students here was so great for so many years. And I suspect that the years that those students spent here will have a very profound impact on them. I met a few of those students, in my time here, and I also interviewed a few of them at music festivals. to get their sense. And I observed similar disquieting things about how Taiwan was essentially becoming a base for Chinese nationalist patriotic education inadvertently. But I wish there was more research on that.
Thank you.
If you have more actually to paste in there, maybe that would be of interest to me as well as other people in the group. But I'm thinking of Wang Honglin's I think co-authored work. Some
Oh, definitely bring Hongren back again to talk about research on that.
Yeah, and I read a lot of books written by Chinese students. They publish in Taiwan. Yeah, they decided to publish those books in Taiwan, talking about their opinions about Taiwan. Yeah, they are quite interesting.
Because the student situation would be completely different from the tourists, but kind of going back to what Lennon was saying about the brainwashing. What I got out of your book, Ian, was that these ideas about territory and about what is China and what is Taiwan that were reinforced for these Chinese tourists. A lot of it was done through this system of tourism and enabled by people in Taiwan, because it's much more powerful for when somebody in Taiwan says, "Look, Taiwan is a part of China. We're all one country," and that's what. Well, in your book, you usually point finger at the KMT, and definitely it was the KMT, but also a lot of people who wanted to make money, and understandably so. So this capitalist system of tourism really created this what Lenin calls brainwashing. I don't want to use the word brainwashing, but I can say what Lenin calls brainwashing.
Yeah, my tour guide, the one who kept saying things like our premier Wen Jiabao, and using phrases like "Zamen Zhongguoren," we Chinese people, and referring to indigenous people not as indigenous but as ethnic minorities, is Shaoshu Minzu, was doing this on his own accord. This was not because of a training manual that he received from the PRC. This was something he did to keep his job, to keep the money flowing. He did seem to share this ideology to some extent. He was actually in a far right blue unificationist group. But I saw other tour guides who are not, as far as I could ascertain from interviews, not particularly ideological, also tactically altering their language in ways, again, really just for money. But the thing again about I guess capitalism being pushed to these economic ends is that capitalism in itself, but also any territorial practice is of course riven with contradictions and will produce crises eventually, and that seems to be what happened here. To get back to your question or observation earlier about the wishful thinking of tourism scholars and politicians, I think it's very easy for tourism scholars to think that what they're doing is good for the world, and certainly easy for tourism industry representatives to want to think they're making a difference in a good way. It's not just about making money, but it's somehow about raising living standards, bringing revenue to places that need it. All these words, sustainable tourism, regenerative tourism, and so on, are certainly marketing ploys for trade associations, but I think there are ways that tourism scholars soothe themselves in ways that social scientists, I guess, are perhaps less concerned to do, especially those who think more in terms of conflict, crisis, struggle, and so on. I don't know. I don't. There's been since prior to this book, like some of the articles I published about this case and other scholars who've started to notice that actually tourism is geopolitical, leading to actually a whole sea shift in the treatment of tourism among tourism scholars. There's now book after book about tourism geopolitics, work being done within Australia by actually China-focused scholars looking at the use of tourism in the South China Sea, something I'd written about earlier, but someone who actually read my work and went on to actually do ethnography on one of these boats, because she could do that. She's a Chinese national. I can't go on those boats. At least this particular gap in the research seems to be getting filled in, even as Chinese tourism became that much harder to research in the last few years, thanks to it just simply disappearing.
On the other hand, from what Phil has said and from your own comments about your time in Dulan, there's also room for creating greater understanding, perhaps. I don't want to, backpackers like to pat themselves on the back and say, we're not tourists, we're travelers, or something like that. But from the brief comments that you made there does seem to be some room to say, oh, we do tourism is actually what matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's strong support to resume at least independent tourism from China to Taiwan. I suspect that most Taiwanese people would be perfectly happy about that. I think in most cases, those interactions were perfectly fine for most Taiwanese people, and certainly for most Chinese tourists, including repeat visitors who enjoyed however they imagine Taiwan, be it as the Hawaii of China, be it as a long lost Cold War appendage, however the case, a place that they could come and chill out and enjoy night markets in ways that promoted more or less an awareness that these are people not necessarily enemies and not necessarily stooges or dupes of people that those tourists previously didn't understand. So yes, one can always hope that at least a tourism whose revenues and flows are distributed a bit more evenly, a bit less directed through cartels and monopolies, one would hope, promote some degree of understanding, whether or not one wants to subscribe to any sort of deterministic contact hypothesis. One could hope, and has certainly there's certainly evidence to support it, as parts of my independent tourism chapter would bear out.
Yeah, but scale, I guess, would always be an issue. I mean, it's just a completely different world, isn't it? Okay. Wow. That was a fantastic discussion. If nobody else has any questions, can everybody join me in thanking Ian for coming and giving us a talk today?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ian.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, Ian. And hopefully we'll get to meet in person sometime soon. I'll be over there in November. So
well, I believe I'm going before you, correct? I'm going on Sunday.
That's right. You're going like next week. You win.
Sunday.
Yeah.
No, before we close the section, for those who are in Australia, especially in Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra, we are having another film screening, and have a film screening of what's it called? Untold Her Story. Untold Her Story by Yao Wen-zhi, and Yao Wen-zhi will be here in Australia to do QAs after the film screening. So it'll be happening in Sydney on 30th of October, and in Canberra on 31st of October, and in Melbourne on 2nd of November. 3rd of November.
3rd of November.
Yeah. So if you're around, if you're interested, feel free to join us.
Great. I wish I could join that. The last time I saw Yao Wen-zhi was at Burning Man 2015. He came to the Nevada desert for that event. Is quite a character. I think he'll be very animated at your film screening.
Fantastic. Sounds good. Okay. Thanks very much, Ian. Thanks, Phyllis, Lennon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And hopefully we'll see some people on the 3rd of November, if you're in Melbourne. Okay.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Good night.
Night.
Good night.